Welcome back. I am John P. Today we are going to be talking about 3 reasons why Grand Seiko may not be for you. Now, before people jump to conclusions, right? Grand Seiko is a very popular brand. Grand Seiko enthusiasts are some of the most passionate enthusiasts of everything or anything, let alone wristwatches. Before we jump to any conclusions, let me say I like Grand Seiko a whole lot. The things they're doing today, especially, are truly amazing in terms of the craftsmanship, some of the finishing, the polishing, the Zaratsu finishing, as well as their dial construction is unbelievable, especially at the price point. I like Grand Seiko. But because I've worked with so many collectors, both on my Instagram, The Real John P, as well as Delray Watch, delraywatch.com, where we buy, sell, trade watches, including Grand Seiko. We sell a lot of Grand Seiko watches. There are 3 things, and it's not going to be just branding, by the way. I'll touch on that at the end, but there's 2 other things that are very important that have turned away Grand Seiko buyers from actually wearing the watches. There's 2 things, and these are things that commonly are brought up by certain types of collectors. And so if you're thinking about a Grand Seiko watch, please do consider these 2 things. I'm not trying to turn you away, but these 2 things may be non-issue for you, in which case we have a moot point and you're gonna love and enjoy the brand because of the things that I just mentioned, because Grand Seiko is doing some truly amazing things with their watches today. The first thing that often surprises collectors about Grand Seiko watches is the thickness. Now, the thickness of Grand Seiko watches, especially we'll talk about the spring drive watches, it tends to turn off watch collectors that either have a smaller wrist or like to wear dress watches, right? It's only Grand Seiko that can take a manually wound watch in 37 millimeters and have the thickness of the watch be nearly as thick as a modern day Rolex Submariner, right? And let's not even consider Grand Seiko's dive watches. Yes, they're larger watches. They're made for diving. Grand Seiko doesn't really make a small dive watch. That seems to be some criticisms that they receive all the time. But nonetheless, their dive watches are several millimeters thicker than the Rolex Submariner. And the Rolex Submariner is not the most slim profile dive watch that exists. Now, I get it. They can't please everyone in every single way, though if you're the type of watch collector or wearer that likes a thinner watch, perhaps it fits more under your dress cuff. Maybe you're an attorney or something where you have to wear certain types of shirts and dress shirts and sleeves and go to an office and all of that kind of thing, then maybe you wear a thinner watch or something more slim every day, and in which case even Grand Seiko's dressier options, for the most part, we can't examine all of their watches. There are some exceptions that they've had, not necessarily in the current catalog, but today, even their most casual watches or dressier watches outside of the sports lineup, they're just thicker. They make room for the spring drive movement, but even the manually wind movements or their automatic movements or even their quartz watches are on the thicker side. This is something that I've seen a lot of people that wear vintage watches, for example. They're into that, the unique aspects of watches, so they're drawn to vintage, but then they pick up a Grand Seiko because of just the raving reviews and they see the dials and they're very unique and special and they're truly on the come up in terms of brand popularity with inside watch collecting sphere today. And then they're turned off by perhaps the thicker case size or the dimensions and the profile. So this is something that I see quite often. Once again, I don't see a lot of complaints about the brand, and this may be totally not an issue for you, but this could be an issue if you have a much smaller wrist like myself, or you do wear that particular type of shirts and clothing. Now, rolling on to something that I hear all the time in the comments below, so please don't be shy about this. I hear criticisms about the Grand Seiko bracelets all of the time. Now, when the Grand Seiko Heritage line came out with the 4 seasons, really started, in my opinion, their entry and their foray to these very interesting textured and beautiful dials, right? This collection that came out truly put Grand Seiko on the map for being known for their dial construction, right? It's almost impossible to find a Grand Seiko that comes out today without some unique and interesting dial, and certainly without some a bird or a mountain or a type of tree, naming or giving the watch kind of that moniker, right? There's just a limited edition that was released today with a particular bird or a bluebird from Japan, and that seems to be just where Grand Seiko is doubling down, is on these dials. But the bracelets, especially on that heritage line, were just lackluster, or they felt to be lackluster from the watch collecting community. You had people that were used to wearing much more expensive watches than something at this price point, about $6,000, $5,000 if you got a great deal at the time. And so they were coming from something like a Rolex Submariner or a Datejust. And these are bracelets on these Rolex models, the Oyster bracelet, the Jubilee bracelet, that have, 100 years nearly of iterative improvements. And they expected that kind of a thing coming from these bracelets that had been out, a year or less? And so not everyone felt these sentiments, though there was a bit of a movement behind this. And so I hear this all the time, especially in the comments below. Collectors say, oh, the bracelets don't work for me, the bracelets don't work for me. Now on the flip side, I'll say that especially with the Evolution 9 line and some of the other models, Grand Seiko has tried other bracelets on the watches. And I think it's very unfair for someone to completely disqualify the brand because of bracelets they've used in the past. Now, there's going to be a mixing of bracelets, and also Grand Seiko does offer strap options on a lot of their watches today. And depending on the watch, you will get an entirely different bracelet, right? You can't compare the bracelet that's on the dive watches with the bracelet that's perhaps in one of their heritage lines or something along that line, right? So I think it's a little bit unfair, and I do think that Grand Seiko is going to respond very well to these criticisms because they're trying so hard in every other category, and it seems like they really are striving for that perfection and slowly over time giving the watch collectors exactly what they want. So if bracelets happen to be, either pulling too much on arm hair, which is sometimes you hear about bracelets, or the clasps sometimes people feel are insufficient. There's not, it's more difficult for the clasps to get dialed in for their particular wrist size, or even sometimes I hear resizing the bracelets on the Grand Seikos can be really difficult for people that don't either have a watchmaker or the right kind of tooling compared to some other brands. So I would love to hear your comments on this. Once again, something that pops up all the time. Leave that in the comments below. Would love to hear your opinions on the bracelets. If you want my opinion, I don't think they're that bad. I really like the Four Seasons original collection that came out. I thought the bracelets were sufficient, especially at the price point, but really looking forward to see what Grand Seiko does with their bracelets in the future. Now, lastly, we'll talk about the branding, right? This is something that comes up all the time from people that have been collecting watches for decades and used to that kind of Swiss, it must say Swiss on it, or even maybe that perhaps they've come into the German world of watch collecting with certain brands like A. Lange & Söhne and even Nomos for that matter. But Grand Seiko has truly distanced themselves in ways some never thought possible from just the Seiko brand. Now, I'm not saying that Seiko is something that needs to be distanced from, but if we're talking in terms of price points and in terms of creating truly only a luxury product that people are going to pay a premium for and respect in a way that the watch is more than just a watch, it's actually a luxury product that will be desirable and demanding, and people want to put this in their collection, right? That's where they need to go in terms of selling a $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 plus watch, especially when Grand Seiko is now selling over $50,000 watches. They had to do it. I think they've come a long way. It still has Seiko in the name. There's only so much that they can do about that. But for watch collectors particularly that are true enthusiasts, I don't think that they're today is that much of a care because the quality that is received far outweighs any kind of perception or residual perception that they may have had having that partial Seiko name on the dial. Now, Grand Seiko used to say Seiko at the top and then below it, Grand Seiko in smaller letters. They've done away with that and focused more on the Grand. I get it. They're really trying to maximize what they can do on the branding. But enthusiasts seem to value all of these things mentioned: the dial, the polishing, the case construction, the workhorse movements, the solid, rugged durability of a lot of their watches, and they value that more over the branding. Now, if you're the type of person that needs the watch to be recognized by everyone And this needs to be more of a status symbol, for example. This needs to be a watch that can be worn to different events, and you want people to notice it because you want to talk about it outside of the watch collecting sphere. Grand Seiko might not be a watch that you want to wear every day, but if even you're that person, but you enjoy the dials and things like that, there's no reason you can't put that watch in the mix because of the very special nature of some of the things they do, like the Zaratsu finishing, as well as the dials. But what do you guys think? What do you think about Grand Seiko? Do you think they've truly come a long way, which I actually believe in? Do any of you own Grand Seikos? Or perhaps some of you may even agree with the criticisms that I shared about the brand and the watches that I've heard in the past. I would love to see it and hear it in the comments below. Please do not forget to check out my Instagram, TheRealJohnP, as well as DelrayWatch.com, where we buy, sell, and trade watches. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P.